Thank you very much, Maud, for those very kind words of introduction. And thank you all for coming this afternoon and joining us here for this conversation on the occasion of our exhibition here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. A particular welcome to the artists in the room here. We always love having artists at the gallery, and we appreciate your coming here and enjoying this art museum and our collection, art students as well. This afternoon, I'd just like to range across a few broad issues with you, William. And of course, the main idea here is to get William talking and hear more of him, less of me. So I'm just going to sort of try to prod the conversation in a couple of directions, if I can. But generally, I'd like to cover the areas of how you make your art, what you try to express in your art, ranging from the personal to the political, and also the wide range of media you use to express those ideas. But as we did this morning, I thought it might be good to start with the Black Square, and by a piece of very strange coincidence, William's exhibition starts with an image that relates to Malejevich's Black Square just a week before we open our exhibition from the Hermitage of Modern Masters, which includes a version of Malejevich's Black Square. So just wondering, that might be a place to start. What is that relationship between your work and his work? So it's not the standard relationship, and this morning you had some quite interesting things to say.
So everybody knows the Malevich painting, which is a canvas about this size, and on it there's a sort of an off-white canvas, and there's a black square painted on it, which is iconic in 20th century painting as kind of an early complete abstraction, taking away any reference to the world. It's seen as deeply spiritual. There's a whole library written about the piece. And it's a beautiful painting. The 100 years since it was painted have only added to the craquelure, to the texture, to how the piece feels as a physical object. But one of my interests in it was to discover, in fact, it's not this pure piece of abstraction and Zen painting. And I love the fact that it has a very bastard origin, and the fact that it comes not out of clarity of thought, but out of a mixture of things. The famous Black Square, in fact, started its life just as a piece of costume design that Malevich used to do. And, the costume designers very often have a collage of different pieces of cloths which are put on. From Commedia dell'arte onwards, there's been abstract geometric patterns in cloths that people wear on stage. And what happened was that Malevich had this black square on a costume, and either he, but I suspect not him, I suspect somebody else said that would look great if that was just on a canvas by itself. And Malevich said, "You really think so?" I said, "Well, try it, it's nothing to do." And so this black square was painted on a canvas, and once it was painted, all these other sets of associations came. It could be a new icon in which God was dead, so you could put it in the corner where an icon would have gone, and it was a new vision of the world. It became this much more spiritual object. But for me, the interesting part is to think of it, how does it start in the studio? What is the root? Because almost always, the grand ideas and the interpretations are after the event, rather than the work being an exploration of an event at the beginning. Kandinsky was painting a stage with a grand piano on it that became the first of the great abstractions that he was doing. And the black square, that which we do not remember, that's in the exhibition, the woodcut, came about in a kind of a similarly stupid way. I think one never appreciates quite the degree of stupidity in the studio, and the degree to which thought is rescued by the work, rather than the work being at the service of thought. In this case, I've done a long frieze of images along the Tiber River, which starts off as a black surface of the wall, and then the figures in it are made by washing everything around the figure. So if it's a black surface, you wash around my hand, and when you've washed everything else off and I've taken my hand away, there's a dark shape of the hand on the wall. So we've done all the figures, but I'd got the geometry wrong, or the geography of the 500 meters, and we had a section of about 6 meters left between two figures, which was a black square of unwashed wall. And at first I thought, well, I must think what figure needs to be on that space to match all the other figures. And I couldn't think of the right figure, so we left it as this blank square with the title on it, "This I don't remember. I'm not sure what should be here," which then had to stand in for all the bits of history which we can't remember. And the woodcut is that piece. So it has a And obviously, once it was made and once the square was there, you can't stop all the associations that come onto it, including the association back to Malevich. So there's always, I mean, the artwork exists as an object, and it exists always halfway between the real world and those of us looking at it. If it's a drawing of a horse, there's a horse in the real world, and there's a drawing on the sheet of paper, or the marks on the sheet of paper. And then onto those sheets of mark, we project everything that we know. Images of other horses, of Stubbs, of Jericho's horses, of reading about Don Quixote's horse. And all of those between them make up what the picture is. And so the Malevich has just got richer and richer over the last 100 years. And it does sit in every artist's head as an iconic image. So
and of course,
it's a very long answer to it.
But of course, then those images take, or those objects, take on a whole life of their own. Once they enter the art museum context, then they get researched, recontextualized, presented to the public in various different contexts. But let's keep talking about the process there for a moment, and the starting point of your works in general. In the Black Square, it was that gap along the banks of a Tiber River in Rome. There's an article in the New Yorker titled Lines of Resistance, in which you say, quote, "It starts with images that interest me or provoke me, but also clearly in your studio practice there's a great physicality of the way you work." So I'm just wondering, how do you balance that up, the idea starting in the brain and then what sort of happens physically as you get involved with the work of art?
Well, generally, if a theme arises or a part of the world that I'm interested in, there has to be, for that to flourish, there has to be a meeting between something outside of the studio that is intriguing or outside of me, and a material through which it can be thought, through which it can be, through which the thinking can happen. So it might be, for example, with the opera Lulu, when I understood that one could use woodcuts or black ink drawings as one of the ways of thinking about the opera and its music, suddenly that material, ink and paper and small sheets of paper, released all the thoughts about the opera. So that instead of painting a portrait on a single sheet of paper, it might be made up out of, say, 6 sheets of paper that paints a portrait of Lulu. And then these different sheets of paper can be readjusted slightly. You can make it taller if you shift them up, or slightly fatter if you shift them sideways. You don't like the head, we'll take a new sheet of paper and give her a different head, a different arm. And it both is a way of drawing, of accumulating an image rather than having a clarity from the beginning, and a kind of editing. If you're working with charcoal, you can edit with an eraser. If you're working with Indian ink, then the editing would happen with the rearranging or changing sheets of paper. But what that does itself, it says that the image itself is provisional and unstable. The face is like this, but it could be slightly shifted in different positions. The body, the sheets of the body can shift so that it changes its angle. And what that revealed about the opera, in terms of thinking about it, was about the instability of the object of desire. So in this case, it's about Lulu, who has many different lovers, and none of the lovers and husbands are the men she hopes they will be. So they all end up dying, and Lulu can never be the woman that the men hope they are marrying or having as their mistress. And so it also ends in operatic terms in disaster. But kind of that sense of way into the opera came through the form of the sheets of paper. So that's what I would mean by thinking through using the material to, relying on the paper to lead you in thinking. But then physically in the studio, to talk about the actual studio work itself, so that's a broader process. In the studio itself, I would say there are different stages, one of which is described in one of the works in the exhibition, which is the preamble to the work itself, which happens, and it is a physical thing. It's about literally walking around the studio before the work begins in the day. And it is literally a figure 8 that walks around the studio, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 10 minutes. But it's allowing the activity of walking to engender thinking, in one sense. The other is that you have in the studio all the different objects that are always up in any studio: postcards, newspaper cuttings, photostats, the drawing you were working on yesterday, the drawing that you're hoping to work on today. So the circuit around is also, together with the kind of peripheral vision of all these different things in the studio, there's a kind of peripheral thinking of the ideas between and in amongst them. So that in the end, through this, there's a kind of a gathering of energy, and then the first mark can be made in the studio. So that's the first process. And the second stage, which is not unique to artists, but it always feels very clear in the studio, is the difference between what it is to be drawing, which is a very close one. It's the furthest distance would be an arm's distance between yourself and the sheet of paper. So you're drawing in that, so you have a very myopic view of what you're doing. And the difference between that and the moments when you turn around and you see the drawing afresh. And what happens then is a complete bifurcation of the person, because you've got the one artist, the one person busy making the drawing, the artist as maker, and then you've got the other person, your other self, standing over here, looking at the mess that one is doing, and at the stupidity. From here, it's completely obvious that he's drawn the shoulder like that, and you must bring the shoulder down, and the head is all wrong. And so you give instructions to the other artist to say, okay, just get the head right, and you change it and pull the shoulder down, move the head, erase it, and move the head down, and then step back again. And then you say, so no, that's clearly not what I meant. I mean, I've done it all the other way. And it's that kind of, it's the one at the coalface, so to speak, is always a disappointment to the other. And I'm sure it's the same thing when you write. Sometimes one writes something and you think, as you've written it, you say, God, I'm hot, this is great, this is great. And the next day you reread it and you thought, well, someone in the night came and some idiot's rewritten everything I did. But it was so good yesterday, and today it really doesn't make sense. So that's the difference. So you have the stalking of the drawing and then this somewhat antagonistic conversation. And one of the things about working with the animation is that structure with like the film here, Tide Table, which is that system of drawing and erasing and drawing and erasing, which is a non-stop walk between the drawing and the camera. So it's you draw on the wall, you walk back to the camera, shoot a frame, go back to the drawing. It builds in that conversation as to part of the process, that you're constantly drawing and glancing at what you've done and going back and glancing at what you've done. So for me, that's a very productive way of where the medium itself builds in all of those meanings and dissociations. So that would be that's kind of the daily grind.
Well, in the exhibition itself, the first work you see is that drawing Parcours d'Atelier from 2007, which actually sort of, in a way, documents that prowling around the studio. But the whole exhibition itself, designed by, as Maud said, by Sabine Tonisson in Brussels, is meant to evoke that idea of both the studio and your career. When you move around the exhibition, you're getting a sense of creation places, screening places, reading spaces, the cane chair where you might sit and have a cup of tea. So we're hoping that gives... And the way an artist works with encountering different works from different parts of your career, different times, at the same time when you're creating new work.
I mean, I think there's not like there's a single theme in the exhibition. It's work from different times and different places, but what it does, the hope, is that cumulatively it does get a sense of the excess of making. That it relies on ideas from different eras, music from different places to come together, and that it's a kind of, insofar as there's a polemic in the work over the years, it's a polemic for bastardy, for the mixing of traditions, of saying our only hope is the productive understanding and misunderstanding of each other.
Because in a way, that's what we try to do at an art museum like the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where we display contemporary art and historical art. That mix, when you walk around our building, you're encountering new ideas, you're encountering tradition, you're encountering works of art that are clearly based on earlier works in the building or elsewhere. And I think that is one of our important roles too, is to see that it's not just a continuing evolution, but it's going backwards and forwards and rethinking ideas all the way through. In terms of going backwards and forwards, a lot of your drawing ends up as animation, and a lot of your animation ends up going into reverse, with a lot of reversing and erasing. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about how that works and what that process reveals to you, the challenges and the conclusions?
Well, when I was a lot younger, when I was a student, and I was interested both, I was drawing in the Art Foundation in Johannesburg, and I was working with a student theatre company, and I was both designing, acting, and making images. The strong and the good advice I got from many people was that, for God's sake, choose what you're going to do. If you're going to draw, draw and learn how to draw. If you're going to act, please don't inflict such bad acting on us. Go and learn how to be an actor. And I kept on saying, well, yes, that's right. And at a certain point I decided, all right, I will close the studio and not be an artist. I'm no longer an artist. I will learn to be an actor, and went to Paris to try to learn to be an actor. And I realized after 3 weeks that I'd failed at being an actor, and I would never be an actor. And was stuck then. Wasn't neither an artist anymore nor an actor, and then thought, oh, well, then I'll become a filmmaker. And that was a disaster too. And found after some years I was back in the studio making drawings again. And a few years after that, found I was filming those drawings, and that became a kind of animation. And then invited to start working with a puppet company, and found I was directing theatre. At which point I realized I gave up, that I'd failed. I tried to do one thing, and then it took a while for me to understand, in fact, the only hope for each medium was what they got from outside of themselves. That, in other words, the drawings would be much more interesting if they weren't done as drawings, but were done as applied drawings in the service of a piece of theatre or an animated film. So the drawings that were done to be rubbed out, to be changed, even as drawings, became more interesting than the drawings that I would arrive at otherwise. And also there were many subjects for drawings that would never have arisen if it weren't for the narrative or other needs of this other medium. And so after that I understood that my only hope was in fact to ignore that early advice, to work against that. And so usually the things that have turned out well have not turned out because they're good ideas, but because the work itself has shown what the idea should be or could be. So there's an overabundance of different.
And when you were looking at the possibility of bringing all those different art forms together that you'd experimented with, were there artists where you felt, well, he or she have somehow pulled that together that you would see as a sort of a ray of hope or a model that this may be a practice?
There are many different artists who had fragments of their practice that, for me, were emblematic in that. I absolutely, people who are making films when I didn't think that film should be in art galleries. The first time I saw the films of Tracy Moffat, that for me was a revelation of what...
Tracy's here today.
Yeah, so that was a big revelation of how things could be. The mixture of text and image in Anselm Kiefer, that was the thought about text and image being able to be together. But in fact, I was drawn kicking and screaming into what I was doing. So I used to make drawings, and then I started making animated films. But my first idea was that the films belonged in film festivals, and they were not part of my art making. They were not part of... And when a curator first said, could they show one of my films in an exhibition, I was insulted. I said, but that's not art. You can't show a film in a museum. There are the drawings. And he said, well, all right, if you want to show the drawings also, but really I'm interested in showing the film. And I thought, but that's absurd. People are just going to laugh that out of court. And it took like a year to understand, okay, that's in fact what I do. I make films that can be in a museum. This would have been in the very early 1990s. It was a period just when video projectors were getting smaller and more manageable, and it became easier to show a film in a museum without the complication of loops of 16mm films, which you didn't really have in South Africa. But in that case as well, when I started doing animation, I thought, I'm going to try to do a perfect erasure so you can't see the mess left behind as I'm drawing. And when I first showed the films, I apologized to everyone, saying, I'm trying different erasers. I will get a technique which can hide the trace. And people had to say, but you understand, the trace is the interesting thing of what you're doing. And then I said, oh, no, you're right. Trace is good. Trace is good. It's fine. And it was like this big relief. It took away the responsibility for having to get the... From these experiences rather than out of principle, I'm a great believer of both the stupidity in the studio and a kind of a need for a stupidity in the studio, to give the whim, the impulse, the object, the benefit of the doubt.
Was there a particular curator or a particular art museum who you felt really sort of understood the breadth of your work in the best way, and you feel, I can now see a path where the way I create can actually interact with an audience in a public art museum space? These people really get it.
They were different because it grew from different stages of showing. The first time they showed the animated films to when other broader works came in, the theatre work started being seen. For a long time, the theatre work and the fine art work was separate. So I was working with Handspring Puppet Company, a South African puppet company, and we did several productions. So for a long time in Europe, insofar as the work was known at all, it was known in the theatre world, some years before the fine arts world or exhibition world saw the work, and then a longer time for the two to come together. But there have been, there are fantastic institutions now. I mean, and it's difficult to get a perspective of what that was. I know the first time I did a small project and it still works this way, with an exhibition like this, where you do an exhibition, and not in this one, because Sabine Tinnison and the museum were fantastically efficient, but they've been, and skillful in putting the whole thing together. But there were earlier exhibitions when I was really struggling with the technicians and how it looked, and it wasn't how I expected, and how it would be. Could feel myself getting more and more bad-tempered. And the first time I did a project in the project room at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, I really had a bad projector, and the walls weren't prepared the way I expected them to be, and I could feel myself getting more ratty. And then I had to take a step back and said, no, you have to think about this not in the moment now, but you have to think of this, saying this to your 18-year-old self, and say to your 18-year-old self, it's fine, be calm. In 23 years' time, you'll be having a film up on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art. When I said it that way, then everything was fine. I didn't really mind the bad projector and the frustration. So there's been a way in which many institutions have had a kind of an openness. The project at Cockatoo Island with Carolyn Christoph, who's a wonderful curator in the sense that she is both provocative and demanding and very open to what is being done. That was a kind of a project that was gathered into being by the conversation with the curator.
So can we turn back now for a moment to Johannesburg, where you have your house and studio and where you live most of the year when you're not travelling as you are right now. I mean, clearly a city of very perplexing opposites of wealth and poverty, of beauty and of a degree of urban ugliness, political challenges. Has there been how much of your work, or the political side of your work, is specific to, say, Johannesburg and South Africa, and how much is of a general sort of world conflict or global
I think
issues?
that there are very few pieces that don't, in one way or another, have a connection back to Johannesburg. The Méliès, the 7 fragments from George Méliès, is very much the start of an exploration about what happens in the studio, what are the processes through which works come into being. So that one is not specifically Johannesburg-oriented, although the landscapes are local. But almost all the other pieces, even if the subject is not specifically Johannesburg, are inflected by it or relate to questions that are in the air in Johannesburg or in the country. So the most recent piece that we finished in July in London, The Head and the Load, is about Africa and the First World War. So on the one hand, it's a historical piece, part of the centenary of the First World War. But as the piece developed, it became clear that it was much more about the paradoxes of colonialism. And those questions and paradoxes are so much part of contemporary conversation, not just in Johannesburg and South Africa, but in many places, but in a very heightened form in South Africa. In terms of the actual musicians, actors, a lot of the collaborators I work with are very Johannesburg-based. And so I'm sure even though the work could be done very often in many other places, a lot of the specific shapes that give it its meaning and its intangible meanings come from being rooted in that place.
Now, you spent a lot of time you're quite a frequent visitor to Australia. Your wife Anne is from Australia. A lot of relatives here, and many in the audience, and so welcome to all of you. And you've been exhibiting with Annandale's galleries for many years. When you think about South Africa and you think about Australia, what sort of, and we're obviously both, we have a colonial similarity, what things seem familiar to you here, different? What lessons can we learn from your experience in Johannesburg and South Africa?
Gosh, that's a hard one to know what you could. I'm not familiar enough really with the intricacies. I mean, one of the things that always surprised me, which was a big difference when I first came here, and I understand there's logics to it, that in the museum here, you have a section devoted to Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islander art. Our history in South Africa was so much about saying, this section of the museum is for white art, this section may be for black art. It's almost like saying, these are the white keys of the piano, you can play on those, and those are the black keys, you black people can play on those few keys. And the struggle against apartheid was, in a sense, to break that down, to say the museum can be a place for all work, and that if you happen to be a black artist, it doesn't mean your work can't be seen in the room next door to where the Van Goghs are. Only for a white artist can your work be seen. So that seemed bizarre to me when I first came here, to find that. And in the South African context, identity politics becomes extremely negative and becomes very dangerous. And I understand the different power shifts between white privilege and the position of black artists, but in South Africa it has been so much an effort over all those years against apartheid to fight against that kind of bifurcation. And Johannesburg is also a city which is about, the only hope is one of bastardy, of one of mixing of traditions, of half-understood traditions. I mean, just to give one example, we have two famous citizens of Johannesburg. James Coetzee was in Cape Town. We can't claim him from Johannesburg. But our most famous citizen, of course, is Nelson Mandela, whose life was very much shaped by his period in Johannesburg. But Gandhi, who was in Johannesburg for 20 years and where he formed his political philosophy. So he'd come to Johannesburg as this English-trained barrister, completely divorced from his Indian spiritualist roots, and worked in Johannesburg taking cases for Indian traders from Gujarat primarily. And it was in Johannesburg that he was introduced to the Bhagavad Gita, to Sanskrit, to that whole tradition which he then embraced and became the basis of his politics. And how did he get to it? Not through studying these books. He gets into it by being introduced to it by Jewish Johannesburg architects who've been reading Indian mysticism, not through reading Indian mysticism, but through reading John Ruskin, who's been reading Madame Blavatsky. So you have this Russian mystic coming through this English aesthete to the Johannesburg Jewish architect, back to Gandhi, through whom he discovers his. So it's also about a mistranslation and a misunderstanding and the power that this brings. With Mandela, it was the case of coming as quite a narrow nationalist to Johannesburg and coming across different resistance patterns of the Transvaal Indian Congress. And the Transvaal Indian Congress, which was largely a Hindu organization, had learned from passive resistance from Muslim Indians in the late 19th. So the sense of this mixing of different insights, connections, leaping from one to another, has always been vital in Johannesburg. Because it doesn't have a long history. The city's 130 years old. I know there are corners of, or not corners, there are large sections of people. You'll meet someone in Australia and said, oh, how long's your family been here? And they'll say, well, we've been in this corner of the river for 30,000 years. And that's not the case of the people who are in Johannesburg. You know, there were certainly people 1,000 years ago, and there were people, different people 500 years ago, but the city itself has always been made up of migrants from Mozambique, from other parts of South Africa, from Europe, Cornish miners from England.
Just to go back to your comment about the display of art here and Aboriginal Australian art. I think one thing we're very proud of here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where this issue has been very close to our heart, is this is the first art museum where, in fact, Aboriginal Australian art was both purchased as and shown as art in an art museum, as opposed to, say, a history museum or ethnographic museum. And what we do here is we both have Aboriginal art galleries, the Yiribana Gallery just across here, where that art and the work of those artists can work within that context. But we also very clearly distribute paintings and works of art in other parts of the gallery. So in our 20th century Australian galleries, we show those works of art acquired in the late 1950s by Tony Tuxon, our then deputy director, as well as works that came out of the Papunya movement in the 70s in contemporary galleries. So I think the idea now is to try to do a bit of both.
Yes, I was thinking in answer to your question about what can Australia learn from saying that this is about me not understanding, not about understanding, but about when I saw it, I said, okay, I must understand there are very different processes and contexts that are being revealed here. Yeah. It is always a question. I mean, you have in the museum, you have the work in Paris that is halfway between that was taken from an ethnographic museum to the Quai Branly. And each of them feels an unsatisfactory answer, because are you saying this must be understood as a ritual object, but it can't have its place as an object of beauty? Or do we take it out and put it as a section of beauty, but we lose its context? And that each answer feels unsatisfactory. And so one has to find the less good idea to understand that the impossibility of finding a good resolution. You have to say, we will always be stuck with the provisional resolution of how this should work.
So let's leave for a moment Johannesburg, Sydney and Paris behind and move to Harvard University. 2012 you presented the Norton Lectures, which are Harvard University's preeminent lecture series in the arts and humanities, as a Norton Professor of Poetry. And you entitled your lecture series 6 Drawing Lessons. So I wonder if you could say a few words about what are those lessons that you draw from drawing, that we can gain from drawing an audience in an art museum, or just practicing drawing?
Well, as you say, the Norton Lectures are a very prestigious set of lectures, and they're usually given by art historians, the ones that are art or poetry experts or literary critics. And I thought I'd better try to do one of those lectures. Mm-hmm. And then I discovered, no, I was trying to give a lecture about Titian and Michelangelo, but drawing all my information from Wikipedia. And I thought, this is, let's start again. This is not a good idea. So the only way in which I could start was to say, all right, let's choose 6 works of mine as a starting point. Mm-hmm. So start the lecture each time with a work and then expand outwards the ideas that go out. So the lectures themselves had to end up as a kind of the presentation of them as a drawing lesson, which is to say, to discover what they were about in the process of writing and delivering them. So none of them teach you how to draw, I'm afraid. None of them actually have a lesson about drawing, although a lot have to do with what happens in the studio and the big questions that arise not before the work but after. All of the lectures were done as interpretations of the work afterwards rather than as good lectures. And the first one started with a lecture about the limits of language, which there had to be for saying the drawing is primary and the interpretation is secondary. And so it had to do a lot with all the things, when one thinks of language as we're speaking now, if you type out the words, and it should have a logical argument when you reread it, but of course in the context of a lecture the words are one thing, but the pauses, the gestures are all part of the rhetoric of trying to convince people of what you are saying. So that language can also be seen as kind of floating above the world rather than always tied down to it. And the way of saying I trust the drawing, certainly in terms of my own thinking, more than the language that can float around it. But I suppose it was a lot about the practical, the physical activity of what it is to be, what is the relation between the body and making a work in the world, which is what you do if you're an artist primarily, for me. I mean, there's a way, is it thinking with an extent, are you drawing with the full extent of your whole body and arm, or are you just drawing from the shoulder, or are you just drawing from the elbow, or just from the wrist, or just with the knuckles? And trying to say, how do we keep the drawing and the thinking with that expansiveness? What is the degree of tension in your body when you're working? Is it a kind of an exhausted so that it's, or is it like a commedia dell'arte? Everything is very angular. So it's talking about these kinds of physical, the movement between the physical into the drawing and what that provokes in terms of thinking.
When you're thinking about drawing like that, have you ever attempted, calligraphy or learning Chinese calligraphy? Have you worked with calligraphers? Because there's a very...
I've never worked with calligraphers. I work a lot with Chinese ink and with Chinese calligraphic and painting brushes on that kind of paint. And there are different projects which have used calligraphic marks as a score for musicians to work with them. And each time there, I try to get tips on how one's meant to do it, and how the ink should be, and how your hand should be above the paper, of how you look after your brushes. There's one work on the exhibition that is very much about that, a tree. Now, when you see calligraphers and people doing beautiful things with Chinese brushes, you can go the way a brush is shaped. It's from quite a dense grouping of hairs to a very fine point, so that you should be able to get a finest line to a really thick mark back to a very fine line. And the great calligraphers can do that, or do it as a matter of course. But I found that, I don't know what I got wrong, or the ink was wrong, or I didn't clean my brushes right. But for the first hour, the brush would keep a beautiful point, but at a certain point it would just splay out, and you try to do a neat line, and you've got 6 lines, and I would go through brushes, because keeping a good brush for a short while, and it became the battle between the good and the bad brushes. And then I suddenly realized, okay, with the bad brush, what it does, it has this ugly set of marks, but depending on how you place them down and do them, it has something of the random sprayedness of foliage, which is always a question for artists. How do you draw 50,000, 500,000 leaves on a tree without doing a series of tiny knuckle marks? And even then you can't do all the leaves. But there was something about the splayed brush moved in different ways that had the random patterns of leaves. And so the trees, all the series of paintings, and over about 2 years, there were maybe 15 or 20 paintings of trees from near Johannesburg that relied on what these bad brushes could give you to do the paintings. So it was a way, if the brush themselves suggested that subject of foliage, of trees, and then it became about a tree being turned into a book, and then a tree painted on top of the book going back into the series of images, and the whole series of explorations and expansions came out of that brush and the tree. I'm not sure how we got here. What's the question?
It doesn't matter.
But that would be another example of the medium leading the thinking.
Yeah.
And then once you're into books, there are so many sets of associations of, and most of the books I draw on are old dictionaries or encyclopedias, which people are turfing out, because they get obsolete so quickly now.
William, in 2016, you started up a new centre in Johannesburg called, with a very fine name, the Centre for the Less Good Idea, which was meant to support experimental cross-disciplinary art projects. Could you say how that's been going? I gather you've given it 3 years. It doesn't have to go on forever. What are you hoping it will do, and how are you going to judge whether you think it's worked or not?
We've had 3 seasons. We had do 2 seasons a year, and the principle it works on is finding a curator for each season who's invited to bring in artists, musicians, photographers, dancers, whoever they want, to work either on their own projects or together, and at the end of the 6 months have a 4-day presentation of work that's been made. But it's very small scale. So it encourages the short form. You don't have to think of, I'm making an hour-and-a-half piece of theatre. It can be a 15, 10-minute piece. It's about people who wouldn't normally have worked together, working together, and finding the energy and the new ideas that come from working outside of your discipline. In the same way that images arose that were provoked by working in film, that wouldn't have come just as as images by themselves, it was just drawing. The same thing is to show the possibilities of collaboration.
Yeah.
It's also to say it's done without an agenda. It's, people don't have to write a proposal and work the project out in advance. First write the essay, and then do the work. It allows the work to happen. And the name comes from an African proverb, which paraphrases that, if the good doctor can't cure you, find the less good doctor. And it's about the idea that when grand ideas no longer work, and we think of the calamity of so many of the huge ideas of the world, that the hope has to be for things in the margin, in the peripheries, that can actually show us different routes forward. And there have been some things that have been truly terrible that have been made there, but there have been a few things that are spectacularly beautiful, that astonished the people making them and the people watching them, but particularly the people making them. And so we have a season coming up the week I get back. We go in rehearsal for the next season, and I think there are going to be 3 or 4 really, really beautiful things in it. And I'm there partly as a mentor. You know, when the workshop are happening, it's hard for me not to be involved with putting my all in. But it's largely other directors, other people making their work there.
And speaking of the grand art form, we should touch upon opera, since that is one of your links with Sydney, and your production of Wozzeck by the Austrian composer Alban Berg will be staged at the Opera House from January 25 to February 15 next year. You've also, I think most people here would know, you've produced the Magic Flute. I think that premiered in 2005. One of the works in the exhibition, Learning from the Flute, from Naomi Milgram's collection, is in this exhibition, which I think came out of some of your research for the Magic Flute. So just what has attracted you to the operatic form?
I suppose the space it gives. I mean, there is Wozzeck that's coming, the Alban Berg, at the Annandale Gallery here in Sydney. There's, in fact, which has a number of works which are kind of complementary to the exhibition here. The other woodcuts that aren't part of the series here. But there's a piece that comes out of the opera Lulu, the other Alban Berg opera, and it's in a way a prelude to the work that will be in the Opera House next year. But one can think of, I work as a director rather than as a designer in the opera, and so sometimes I think of myself and I'm seen as, I'm the hired director to direct their production of. But I prefer to think of it as, here is this canvas that is 15 meters wide, 10 meters high, and 15 meters or 10 meters deep. And the Opera House invites me to make this 2-hour drawing in that space. And not only that, they will throw in for good measure 15 of the best singers in the world that will come and be part of my drawing. And not only that, they're giving me 80 members of an orchestra and it just gets richer and richer what they offer and what's
Sorry,
put there.
we couldn't do that.
And it becomes this astonishing chance to make this 4-hour drawing or 3-hour drawing. Obviously bounded by the constraints of the particular piece of music and the libretto, but within that there's this space for finding a light, a movement, a shift, a way of thinking. So I think of it as a drawing in 4 dimensions, this big drawing. And it often starts in that same way, with a few images and testing images against pieces of the music, then bringing some actors in to see, or dancers to see what a movement will do with the projections and the images. And there's something about opera which is different from spoken theatre. Particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, where one is very wary of emotions without irony. It's one of the places where direct, huge emotion is broadcast directly. In the opera, if you're in love, you are clearly in love. If you hate someone, the hate is the full sound of the orchestra. Vengeance is declared, and you go straight forward. So there's a kind of, as we know, when you hear fragments or different sections of opera, they get through to one's emotional core in a way that is astonishingly powerful and direct. And the truth about doing the opera, one does it for the pleasure of being in a small rehearsal room with those fantastic voices so close up and so loud. and that however good the final production is, it can never manage or match the real intensity of the first days with the musicians in a small rehearsal room.
And in opera and in theatre, you've worked with Sabine Tournesson, who has designed the exhibition here, which has been a fantastic experience for all of us here in the gallery. I think it's the first time she's worked on an exhibition design of a scale with you, but I was wondering, any thoughts about where this exhibition might lead you in terms of sort of stage design, exhibition design, and how your sort of artworks as opposed to your operatic productions might work in a new way in the future?
I mean, it started off when we did the Refusal of Time, which was a video installation piece that was in Document of 7 years ago, 6 years ago. I think so. She was involved in the orchestration of the space in which and was really the designer of the space in which the projections and all happened. And from that, wherever it's been installed, and it's been installed in many different institutions, she started doing that, and then started, when there were extra works in the exhibition around that, working with that. And now has done this exhibition. She's done a beautiful exhibition in Frankfurt for me, one in the Louisiana Museum, and each time there are materials I haven't expected, like the cork that's here is a new material that she'd come across somewhere and decided we needed it for this exhibition. And it's very beautiful, I think. I mean, she's done a much more imaginative job than I could ever have done in the space. And there's something about some of those gallery rooms, the studio rooms and the reading rooms with the lamps hanging down and the light and the bar on it, that do feel like, oh, I could imagine this is a beautiful theatre set by itself. I don't know what the production is, but it's... I suppose that shifting between what's in theatre and what is in a museum sometimes does flow between them.
Probably needs to flow a bit more. We get in the sort of the big blockbuster type exhibitions, you get much more of a sort of stage set feeling for it. But then I think in the future we'll just get exhibitions will tend to be more designed. I think sort of ideas flowing across from different media where appropriate. Sometimes really you want to keep it very simple.
Sometimes the plain white gallery with pictures hung and lit is just...
Or one picture in one room.
One picture in one picture is just fine. So I don't think this is the universal pattern. I think for the show we're doing here, which has to do with the expansion of the studio around, it's a very, very good design. I think she takes the credit for that, not me.
I think we've probably got time for a couple more ideas, because I feel we are probably running out of time a bit. And you've talked about, and thinking about the future, you've talked about the undrawn, things yet to be drawn. What are those things that I know this is probably not quite what you mean by, but what are those things that you feel you have yet to draw, or ideas you've yet to tackle and turn into works of art?
I think that list which you refer to is about not that, but it's connected. This was a list I drew up last year saying, I always end up drawing the same things. Let me make a list of what I've drawn, some things that I've drawn in my life before, and then a list of things that I've never drawn in my life. Sunrise over Cairo. I've never drawn sunrise over Cairo. A hippopotamus. I've drawn a rhinoceros, a lion, a cheetah, a zebra, a giraffe, and I shouldn't go through, but somehow never a hippopotamus. I've drawn this object, but never that object. I've drawn teapots and coffee pots, milk jug. I think I've drawn a milk jug. A soup tureen. Yes, I have drawn a soup tureen. A grater, a food grater, thinking of kitchen equipment. A colander. Yes, I've definitely drawn that. A jam strainer, thinking just of objects in the kitchen. What have I never drawn? Salt and pepper shakers, all right. So that would be on the list, salt and pepper shakers. And then, so I said, right, for the year, I'm only allowed to draw from the right-hand list, things which I have not drawn and not things of that which have been drawn before. And I came to it and I thought, my hand somehow just doesn't have the energy to draw the rhinoceros, the hippopotamus. But I'm happy to draw the 400th rhinoceros again. So it's not as simple as saying this is what I want to draw or not. So one can you have to say cumulatively, obviously, everything you've spent your life drawing becomes de facto a self-portrait. You're made up out of all the things that you've chosen to draw. And you could say, in the same way, you could do a negative sort of portrait. Everything around you filled in the air, filled with everything that's not been drawn. So in a strange way, it's also revelatory. But I found it with great difficulty to move from the one list to the other.
Yeah. And finally, another recent Norton Professor of Poetry at Harvard was the Nobel Prize-winning Turkish author Orhan Pamuk, who of course wrote that wonderful book, The Imaginary Museum. And I'm just wondering, as a final place to leave, since you're now working with us in an art museum, what would be in your imaginary museum? Apart from your own work, of course.
No, my work doesn't need to be there at all. I do like exhibitions in which people take idiosyncratic things out of storerooms of museums and get you to look at them again. But as soon as they're beautifully installed and displayed, they immediately get a kind of preciousness which you wish they didn't have, which they didn't have when they were in the storeroom when you were looking at them in that rough form. So again, it's a question of finding the least bad solution of something becoming made too precious when it's too perfectly displayed and having it not seen at all. But I'm really bad at choosing works from institutions when I've been invited to do so. And they say we've got 2.5 million prints in the Louvre. Choose whichever ones you want. Yeah. It's much easier to me. They say, here are 17 prints, choose 4 of them and we'll display those. Whereas some artists are very good at rummaging through things and picking out all different things and making beautiful installations. So the Pamuk Museum, which has really beautiful odd objects, postcards and broken bits of pottery and an old lamp from the 1920s and a barbershop sign from 1815 and all the cigarette butts collected over 3 years by somebody who smoked and annotated with the day everyone was smoked. There's a wonderful craziness of collection. And as he explains, the book and the museum happened at the same time. I think it's called, the book is called the Museum of Innocence, I think. And when I had occasion to meet with him, I said, did you write the book and then hunt for all the objects? Or did you find all the objects and put them into the book? And he said, no, it was about 60-40. There are about 60, I can't remember which way, of finding objects which he liked and finding a place for them in the book and writing the book and hunting for objects that were there in the book. And that sort of oscillation between discovery and then pushing the discovery seems to me a very good way and metaphor for the way the work has to move between knowing what you're doing or recognizing something and hoping it will come to make sense afterwards.
Which is what we do all the time here. And when we get to stage an exhibition like your exhibition here, we are very, very, very happy, very honored and proud to work with you. And it's been very, very generous of you to spend so much time with us today, both this morning with the media and now having this conversation with so many of our close museum friends and artists in Sydney. We love having you in Sydney, and we are just enjoying every day being in your exhibition. And we hope you'll continue to come back to Australia often. We wish you luck with the opera next year. And finally, would you all please join me in thanking William for his time here?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.